We would like to welcome everyone. I would like to begin by thanking Tim and Miriam and the other people who have helped make the seminar possible. Christian Osterman is going to introduce the speaker this afternoon, but I want to say just a word about Mel. I just asked him whether I could say something ridiculous about him to make people laugh, and he said, no, I'm very straight. There's nothing ridiculous about me. I do know that when we were negotiating the title of all of this, you know there's always a back and forth about what the most appropriate title will be. I said, Mel, you know there's an irony about some of these Cold War issues. Could we perhaps work that into the title? Never have I got such a rapid reply. The answer was, I do not do irony. We have a sort of ritual where we go around the table, and we'd like to tweak it a little bit so that everyone will have the opportunity not only to identify yourself and your institutional association, but what book you happen to be reading at present. Books that you're reading as part of your work don't count. Books that you're really enjoying. Myself, I've just finished the Bob Woodward book, and I'm into the magnificent biography of Arthur Koestler by Michael Schramm, and that is a wonderful book. The first person who gets to introduce himself is the new executive director of the American Historical Association.
And I have to continue the book theme, Roger?
Yes.
No, you don't. I don't.
I'm Jim Grossman. I'm the executive director of the American Historical Association. I'm reading Freakonomics. You don't really want to get into that.
Arnita Jones. I discovered that they use ancient for former directors in France, so I guess I'm the ancient director of the AH.
book?
No book. I'm just finishing something called Deep Ancestry, which is very interesting. It's not exactly history, but it is.
My name is Dick Iron. I'm a former colleague of Dr. Leffler's at the University of Virginia. I dabble in cultural diplomacy as a historical problem and as a public policy problem.
Robert Townsend, American Historical Association, and I'm reading Churchill's Empire.
Great.
For fun and profit.
Nora Lee Frankel, American Historical Association. I just finished Calvin Trillin's tribute to his wife called Alice.
I'm Frédéric Bozo. I'm a professor at the Sorbonne and currently at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I've moved from the Cold War to the post-Cold War, and I'm working on Iraq 2003. And I'm afraid to say I'm reading Tony Blair's memoirs.
I'm Don Wolfensberger with the Congress Project here at the Wilson Center, and even though it's work-related, I just finished reading the book Pinstripe Patronage by Martin Tolchin and Susan, and we're going to have a book launch for it on Wednesday.
Roy McLeod, Smithsonian Air and Space Museum and the University of Sydney. I'm reading about trillion-dollar wars.
Dirk Moses, also from the University of Sydney, currently visiting here at the Wilson Center. I'm just finishing Tom Segov's biography of Simon Wiesenthal.
Jim Banner, the National History Center. Roger, just to please you, I've just finished Max Beerbohm's Zuleika Dobson with Beerbohm's illustrations. I recommend the original edition to all of you.
I'm not but a humble intern, so I'm reading what I'm told to read. But your ends of British imperialism changed my life. So,
Sam Wells here at the Wilson Center, working on the Korean War and just for kicks, reading a book about NATO, the current issues.
Stanley Falk, unaffiliated historian. I've just opened a book by Paul Springer called America's Captives, which is a history of how we've treated POWs going back to the Revolution.
I'm Pat Harahan, recently retired, and I'm reading a book called The Bielski Brothers on World War II.
Hi, I'm Pablo Leon, a visiting researcher at Georgetown University. I am currently working on U.S. public diplomacy in Spain during the Cold War.
I'm Francisco Rodriguez, also from Spain, where we are friends in college, and I'm working in American cultural diplomacy effort in Spain during the 50s and 60s, and especially in American studies and anti-Americanism.
I'm Tom Dell, former DOD, and I just finished reading Black Tents of Baluchistan, which is 4 or 5 tribes in Sistan. Fascinating book.
Ross Johnson, just finished 2 books on Cold War broadcasting. Just reading Fitzroy MacLean's A Short History of Scotland.
Holly Galley. I'm reading, it's partially work, but I'm reading Britain's Declining Empire.
I'm Erin Mahan. I'm the OSD chief historian and a former student of Mel Leffler's. He will not like what I'm reading. I think I'm the only one who will say a non-history book. I'm reading The Art of Fiction by David Lodge to keep my prose fresh.
Tom Adams, retired, and between some heavy reading on social welfare in Europe, I'm going back to an old book, Dangerfield, A Strange Death of Liberal England.
I'm Les Benedict, emeritus from The Ohio State University and parliamentarian of the AHA, and it just so happens I'm reading Don Quixote.
My name is Christine Dell. I just graduated from the University of Virginia, and today I'm here with my dad, Tom Dell, and I'm about to read What the Dog Saw by Malcolm Gladwell.
Bill Burr. I work at the National Security Archive at George Washington University and work on U.S. nuclear policy.
I'm Miriam Cunningham, and I'm from the National History Center, and I'm in between books, so this is very good.
Ronald Steele. I'm a fellow here at the Wilson Center this year. I'm doing a book on the cultural roots of American foreign policy, and I'm reading Alan Riding's Paris Under the German Occupation.
David Painter, Georgetown University. I'm working on oil and world power.
I'm Toshi Higuchi. I'm a PhD candidate at Georgetown University. I'm working on dissertation about the international risk review of radioactive fallout, and as a PhD candidate, it's time to stop reading and start writing.
I'm Evan North. I'm also a PhD candidate at Georgetown, and I've been reading Alan First's The Foreign Correspondent.
I'm Anand Tuprani. I'm also at Georgetown, reading a rather long and dull book on the British Empire in the Middle East. That's about it.
Paul Foreman, Smithsonian Institution. My work is on the transition from modernity to post-modernity as a cultural process.
I'm Alan Edel, also from the Smithsonian Institution. I'm working on the origins of technocratic visionaries of the 1960s, and I'm rereading David Reisman's The Lonely Crowd.
Hi, I'm Steve Lipson, a master's student in U.S. history, and I'm in the middle of my thesis, so I wish I had time for pleasure reading.
Hi, I'm Grania McFoy. I'm a PhD candidate at Boston College and in American immigration history. And as a visitor to DC, I was a captive audience at the Literary Festival a few weeks ago. So I'm reading Timothy Egan's Big Burn, just finishing it off at the minute.
I'm David Greenberg, a fellow at the Wilson Center. This is all very intimidating and hard to believe. There's no one here reading that dragon tattoo book or anything like that.
Absolutely.
All right. I'm reading the publisher, Alan Brinkley's biography of Henry Luce.
I'm Kent Hughes at the Wilson Center. I've read all 3 of the books, so just to be honest, I work more recently a lot on the global financial crisis. I'm reading the Squam Lake Report on fixing the financial system, but also an overview of Afghanistan by Thomas Barfield and a mystery by Daniel Silva.
I'm Gavin Wright. I'm a fellow here at the center this year. I'll just tell a quick story. I'm a fan of the San Francisco Giants. They used to have a pitcher named Rick Russell. The interviewer asked, he was known as Big Daddy. Big Daddy, isn't it ironic that you're making a comeback against your former team? And Big Daddy said, I'm not into irony.
That's because he played for the Cubs.
I'm Jan Lamberts. I work at the Research Center of the Holocaust Museum, and I'm reading a novel right now by Roberto Bolano called Nazi Literatures of the Americas.
I'm Niu Jun from School of International Studies, Peking University. I do research on the China foreign policy during the Cold War. Now I am visiting scholars in the Wilson Center belonging to the Cold War Study Project.
I'm Stephanie Young. I recently finished a PhD in history at UC Berkeley. Now I work for the RAND Corporation, where I'm a policy analyst in national security policy.
Hi, I'm Iona Tona. I'm a postdoc scholar here at Woodrow Wilson, and I liked very much Susan Carruthers' Cold War Captives. Recommend it.
I'm Ken McDonald. I'm a former chief historian at CIA. I'm sorry, I'm a late arrival. What am I reading now? I'm reading an old C.S. Forester novel called Gold from Crete.
Great.
My name's Melissa Stockdale. I'm a Woodrow Wilson Fellow, and I'm reading a Icelandic mystery novel by Indriason called Jar City.
I'm Ryan Carpenter. I work at the OSD Historical Office, and I'm reading The Third Reich in Power by Richard Evans.
I'm Bill McAllister from the Office of Historian at the Department of State. I'm also a Mel Leffler student, and I'm reading The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis.
I'm Edward Kiefer. I'm an OSD historian working on Harold Brown and Jimmy Carter, and about to read Jimmy Carter's diary for fun and pleasure.
I'm Joe Wysentowski from the Office of the Historian, and I'm reading John Perkins' Confessions of an Economic Hitman.
David Nichols at the Office of the Historian of the Department of State. I'm reading Ellen Taylor's The Civil War of 1812.
I'm Josh Botts, another Leffler student. I also work at the State Department Office of the Historian, and I'm reading David Grossman's novel To the End of the Land.
I'm Oksana Likarenko, Tomsk State University, Russia. I'm a Kennan Institute scholar, and I work on United States policy towards European integration during the Cold War period.
Hi, I'm Carl Ashley from the Office of the Historian at the Department of State. I'm reading No Man is an Island by Thomas Merton.
Richard Eiserman, U.S. Studies at the Wilson Center, and I'm reading A Fiery Peace in the Cold War by Neil Sheehan.
Martin Dimitrov, I'm a fellow here this year. I'm reading a book about the Bulgarian Mafia.
Sonia Michelle, Director of U.S. Studies here at the Wilson Center. I'm reading Jane Miller's Crazy Age.
I'm Joe Brinley. I'm the Center's book publisher, and I'm reading a book called The Elegance of the Hedgehog. And I don't remember who wrote it. My wife handed it to me and told me to read it.
Okay. We got everybody then? Okay. Thank you very much. Let me also welcome you on behalf of the Wilson Center to this Washington History Seminar, which, as you know, is a joint initiative of the AHA's National History Center and the Wilson Center here. And we're delighted today to present to you Professor Melvin Leffler with a presentation on Cold War Legacies. He is, of course, exquisitely and eminently qualified to talk about that subject, since he is one of the historians of the Cold War who really does not need introduction to all of you. He is, of course, the Edward Stettinius Professor at the University of Virginia. I'll skip over all the awards and distinguished positions that he's occupied in government and in academia, just to mention, of course, his award-winning books, A Preponderance of Power, National Security, the Truman Administration, and the Cold War, which won the Bancroft Prize in '93, and For the Soul of Mankind, the United States, the Soviet Union, and the Cold War, which won the George Louis Baer Prize of the AHA, a book which he wrote to some extent here at the Wilson Center some years ago when he was here for a first stint. And, of course, most recently, the 3-volume Cambridge History of the Cold War, co-edited with Arne Westad. He has published numerous other books and articles and is here at the center for the year as a public policy scholar working on post-1998, post-Cold War foreign policy developments, and let Mel go into further detail on that. Let me just, before I turn over the floor to Mel. Mention that next week, of course, we've got Tim Breen here from Northwestern University with a talk on Washington, on ordinary people and the American Revolution. And let me also just remind you to mark your calendars for the spring semester of next year. We already have a full program, a terrific program for all of you, including speakers such as Jonathan Spence. We'll talk about China. Charlie Mayer, Shel Garrett, and others will be here. Again, it'll be the same time, same place, 4 o'clock on Monday afternoons here in the center's 4th floor conference room. With that, and with great thanks to Mel for taking the time to talk to us and give this presentation here today, let me welcome you and turn it over to you. Mel.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure for me to be back at the Wilson Center this year, and thanks to so many of you for coming out. Actually, I've learned a great deal from quite a number of people sitting in this room, so if some of you disagree with my judgments today, you probably have one another to blame, since I learned so much from you. And
hold on. Is the microphone on? I think it's on, so maybe work.
It's also interesting the way historians remember things, or perhaps the way we deal with evidence, because I do remember this exchange with Roger about the title of today's lecture, and it's funny, I don't remember the sentence, although it's perfectly like me to write. I don't believe in irony. What I remember the occasion, and here it is about individual memories when we do oral histories. I remember Roger saying, "What do you want to write on?" or speak on, and I wrote back and I said, "I want to speak about lessons of the Cold War." And Roger wrote to me something like, "Serious historians, sophisticated historians don't write about lessons. They know lessons are too complicated, and you should sort of think about other things like legacies." So I wrote back, "Okay, Roger, write legacies, but I'm going to talk about lessons."
I don't recall that. Nice comeback.
And I have the email. I keep my emails. It's my documentary evidence. Anyway, thanks so much for being here today. As Christian indicated, for several of the last years, in fact, much of the last decade, one of the things I've been doing is working with Odd Arne Westad, the Norwegian historian who's a professor at LSE, on the Cambridge history of the Cold War. For the Cambridge history of the Cold War, we asked approximately 75 scholars from around the world to write essays on critical topics in the Cold War that Arne Westad and I thought were really essential for understanding the Cold War. Naturally, some of the topics were obvious ones that Arne and I chose, like Stalin and the origins of the Cold War, Gorbachev and the end of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, topics of that sort. But then there were a series of essays that we also commissioned to deal with topics like the international economy and the Cold War, in which we had 3 essays, 1 in each volume, human rights and the Cold War, consumer capitalism and the Cold War, science, technology and the Cold War, the environment and the Cold War. These were some of the most evocative and illuminating essays that were submitted. And these essays, along with the traditional topics that, of course, Westad and I knew reasonably well, these essays forced me to think more and more about the real meaning of the Cold War or the lessons of the Cold War, and whether such lessons have any salience for today's world. And of course, today we face lots of challenges, right? We face terrorism, we face the problem of WMD proliferation, we face Islamic fundamentalism, global warming, an ambitious China, a resurgent Russia, unstable financial markets. We face all these issues. So a key challenge for us as historians is whether the Cold War provides any guide to us for tackling these contemporary problems. Does the Cold War tell us anything about threats, goals, priorities, and trade-offs? And I think the answer is yes, as I'm going to explain today. But of course, first of all, it's important to acknowledge, right, that we've learned many, many different lessons in the literature from the Cold War. There are divergent historiographies, and especially some of the most heated controversies that now exist are about the end of the Cold War. And for simplification purposes, I would say that there are two general historiographies about the end of the Cold War, two historiographies that compete to shape our memory and to shape our prescriptions in terms of contemporary foreign policy and grand strategy. So what are the two contrasting narratives that are competing? One, for simplification purposes, I'll call the triumphalist schools. And you all know this interpretation. American policies, the triumphalists say, especially the policies of Ronald Reagan, won the Cold War. We won the Cold War because the United States built strength, possessed moral clarity, and promoted democracy. So this is one interpretation of the Cold War. Then there's an alternative school. And for simplification purposes, again, I'll call this the blowback school. And the blowback interpretation goes something like this. American policies in the Cold War were misguided and short-sighted, most particularly at the end of the Cold War. American officials exaggerated the strength of the adversary. American officials overbuilt U.S. military capabilities and weakened the American economy. Furthermore, in order to thwart Soviet expansion, the United States aligned itself with conservative autocrats like the Saud family in Saudi Arabia, with authoritarian dictators, let's say like the Somozas in Nicaragua, and even with radical jihadists. The United States, say the blowback school, is now facing the consequences of these policies. In fact, exponents of the blowback school go on to question even whether the United States won the Cold War. They say that the massive debt and trade imbalances and the huge military expenditures of the United States distorted the American economy and ultimately enabled competitors to take advantage of America's foolish policies. So let me make clear right at the beginning where I stand with regard to these two schools. I don't really subscribe to either of them. I disagree with the blowback school because I do think there were winners and losers in the Cold War. In fact, the clearest generalization I think that one can make about the Cold War is that the Soviet Union and its form of communism lost the Cold War. And that's a very important generalization, which I'll get back to. Now, I also believe that the triumphalist version of the Cold War is historically wrong, yet extremely consequential. History matters because all of us draw lessons and invoke meaning from the past. Most conspicuously, the people who George W. Bush brought into his administration believed that Ronald Reagan had had a grand strategy to win the Cold War, and this belief that Ronald Reagan had a grand strategy to win the Cold War shaped their own policies in very significant ways. They believed that Reagan built strength, exerted leadership, squeezed the evil empire. They believed that Reagan demonstrated moral clarity, nurtured democracy, deregulated markets, cut taxes, and unleashed free enterprise. And ultimately, their claim is that these initiatives forced Mikhail Gorbachev to capitulate before American power and American determination. Now, it's important to understand triumphalism because probably in our country at least, it remains the dominant, the most influential interpretation of the Cold War. Yet in my view, this triumphalist interpretation of the Cold War is wrong in two very, very profound ways. First, I don't think that Ronald Reagan had a grand, coherent strategy to win the Cold War. And secondly, I don't think that his alleged grand strategy, even if he had one, won the Cold War. Ronald Reagan did not have a grand strategy. And I say this not because I have any desire to denigrate Reagan, because in fact I have considerable respect for him. The problem with triumphalism is that it simplifies Reagan. It also distorts the history of the end of Cold War as I understand it. So Reagan was, in my view, far more complex and a far more interesting man than either his critics or his champions suggest. Reagan did want to build strength, but he wanted to build strength not to fight an enemy, but to negotiate with the adversary. Reagan did support the Strategic Defense Initiative, what we came to call Star Wars, but not because it was a coherent policy in his view to squeeze the Soviets, but as we've now learned from many other historians, not just me, Reagan supported the Strategic Defense Initiative because he sincerely believed in eliminating nuclear weapons. Not many of us who lived at the time would have acknowledged this or knew about it, but the evidence as presented by people like Paul Leto and David Hoffman is pretty convincing that Reagan did want to eliminate nuclear weapons and thought that Star Wars would play an instrumental role. Reagan talked about democracy, but in fact, he supported some of the most repugnant dictators, including Saddam Hussein, and some of the most fundamentalist groups on the face of the globe, including some of the predecessors of the Taliban. So I would conclude that not moral clarity, but moral ambiguity characterized Reagan's policies, if not his rhetoric, or at least not his public rhetoric. Now, this moral ambiguity was most conspicuous, actually, in his desire, in Reagan's desire, to talk to the men in the Kremlin who ran the evil empire, the same men whom Reagan loved to vilify in his public speeches. Yet we now know from a series of private letters that Reagan wrote to Soviet leaders that he actually was extremely interested from the very onset of his administration to engage the very men he loved to demonize publicly. So, for example, to Konstantin Chernenko in early 1984, Reagan wrote a private letter, and he said, "I have no greater goal than the establishment of a relationship between our two great countries characterized by constructive cooperation. We seek to defend our interests, but not to challenge your security. I want you to know," he wrote Chernenko, "I want you to know that neither I nor the American people hold any offensive intentions toward you or the Soviet people. Our constant, our urgent purpose must be lasting reductions of tensions between us. I pledge to you my profound commitment to that end." The significance of this letter is that it's not unique in any way whatsoever. Reagan started writing letters to Brezhnev, continued writing them to Andropov, wrote more letters to Chernenko, and often wrote parts of the letter, especially postscripts, and occasionally the entirety of the letters in his own hands, in his own handwriting, in order to impress Soviet leaders with his own imprimatur. That is, that he was saying this personally, that he really believed in these things and really wanted to engage Soviet leaders. And what's significant in the story of the end of the Cold War is that Reagan wanted to do this long before he knew he was dealing with Mikhail Gorbachev. And as a result of seeking to engage the Soviets, even while vilifying them, Reagan learned more and more about the Soviet Union. And he had some of his closest advisors on the National Security Council staff, like Jack Matlock in 1983 and 84, and Bud McFarlane, start writing short memos to him about many discrete aspects of Soviet politics, Soviet culture, Soviet economy, Soviet society. And in Reagan's diary in early 1984, he wrote the following: 3 years have taught me something surprising about the Russians. Many people at the top of the Soviet hierarchy are genuinely afraid of America. Perhaps that should not surprise me, but it does. And in fact, we know from a number of memoranda dated 1984, shortly after this diary entry, that as various foreign dignitaries came to speak to the president, Reagan would say to them at the end of a conversation, "You know, my advisors, or at least some of them, are telling me that the Soviets are really afraid of us. Do you think this is true?" And of course, one after another said, "Yes, Soviet leaders really are afraid of the United States and are afraid of your public rhetoric." So Reagan did not proceed to squeeze the Russians. What's noteworthy about the period from 1984 to 1988 was that he sought strenuously to engage the Russians. Now, nor did the Cold War come to an end because the Soviets bowed to American strength. From Soviet records, it's increasingly clear that Gorbachev embarked on a reform agenda because of his desire to improve the functioning of the Soviet system. He didn't succeed in this, but that was his primary motivation. In fact, the Strategic Defense Initiative gave Gorbachev's enemies ammunition to use against Gorbachev's own desire to lower military spending and to curtail the arms race. We are surrounded by superior economies, Gorbachev liked to say, not superior weaponry. So in short, the buildup of American military power was not the decisive factor bringing about the end of the Cold War. Triumphalism, therefore, is misleading historically. I don't think it's a guide to constructing solutions to contemporary problems. But neither is the blowback narrative. The blowback school obscures a fundamental truth, and that is that in the conflict between competing ways of organizing political economies, in the conflict between competing visions of human welfare, the Soviet version lost. And this is a very important truth because the Cold War, in fact, was about alternative ways of life. It was a geopolitical struggle, it was an economic contest, but most of all, it was an ideological battle. In his famous book on the Cold War, my colleague Odd Arne Westad characterized the Cold War as a struggle between, quote, an American empire of liberty and a Soviet empire of justice. Now, you know as well as I know that the Americans were not building an empire of liberty, and the Soviets certainly were not constructing an empire of justice. But Westad is right, very much on the mark, in stressing that these two contestants, the Soviet Union and the United States, represented alternative tracks to modernization and to human uplift around the globe. Now, historians more and more are discussing modernization in the context of the late 1950s, the 1960s, and the 1970s. There are more and more books along these lines. But I think this chronological perspective is not quite right. In my view, modernization, human uplift, and nation building were the very bedrock of the entire post-World War II era. The preamble of the United Nations actually starts, "We, the peoples of the United Nations," not we, the states of the United Nations, "we, the peoples of the United Nations, are determined to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom." A few lines later it says, "We, the peoples, are determined to employ international machinery for the promotion of the economic and social advancement of all peoples." And Article 55 of the UN Charter stipulated that signatories must seek higher standards of living and full employment as the prerequisites for peace and self-determination. And just 3 years later, Article 25 of the famous UN Declaration on Human Rights specified, and I'm quoting, "Everyone has a right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family. Everyone has a right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, and old age." These commitments, universal commitments, were the legacy of the Great Depression and of World War II. These commitments were the legacy of 19th century industrialization and of the turmoil wrought by business fluctuations in free market economies. These commitments were the promises of democratic as well as socialist statesmen to their citizenry for the hardships endured in 2 world wars and a Great Depression. These commitments were the product of America's New Deal and Britain's post-war Labour government. These governments were committed to eradicating 5 great social evils, as they were termed in the famous British Beveridge Report of 1942, the evils of illness, ignorance, disease, squalor, and want. It was the obligation of the modern state to tackle these challenges of eradicating these evils. Post-war Italian, French, West German statesmen embraced this challenge. President Truman embraced this challenge and, in fact, universalized it in his Point 4 program in 1949. Truman explicitly committed the United States, and I'm quoting, to assist the people of economically underdeveloped areas to raise their standard of living, end quote. Now, Truman did this because he grasped that the United States was locked in a struggle with the Soviet Union to prove to humankind which system could best deliver on the promises to uplift humanity, augment standards of living, and modernize nations. What's important, of course, is that the Soviets took this struggle extremely seriously. Stalin's successors, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Gorbachev, they didn't believe that they represented an evil empire. The archival record demonstrates pretty convincingly that they believed their system could outproduce capitalism, provide a superior way of life, and serve as an example for all humankind. So the Cold War was a global struggle, not primarily because of Soviet military capabilities, but because communism, socialism, and state planning had enormous appeal in the aftermath of 2 world wars, a Great Depression, and centuries of European imperialism. One should never forget that capitalism was in disrepute at the end of World War II. Its future extremely uncertain. Tony Ute, in his recent book, reminds us by saying, in 1945, few people believed any longer in the magic of the free market. So the challenge for the West after World War II, after the Great Depression, was that it had to prove that integrated market economies could adopt equitable social polities. The West had to prove that economic openness could be made compatible with social democracy and the welfare state. And it was by no means clear after World War II that the West would be able to do this. At the time, of course, communists were insisting that market economies could not stabilize, grow, integrate, and reform. Social change, human uplift, modernization, the communists claimed, depended on the rejection of global markets. And for a while, for several decades, large chunks of humanity around the globe seemed to agree with the foes of free markets and democratic capitalism. Communist parties grew astronomically during the war and its immediate aftermath. The triumph over fascism revitalized the appeal of communism. The Soviets became proud of their system. Communist parties in places like France and Italy competed effectively for national power. And the substantial growth rates of several sectors of the Soviet economy in the late 40s and 50s underscored the attractiveness of state planning and a command economy for many peoples in the Third World. These people were throwing off the shackles of imperialism and looking for a fast track to growth and to modernization. So the Kremlin was a formidable competitor in the 50s and 60s. When it appeared to unlock the secrets of rapid industrialization and modernization. The Kremlin was a formidable competitor in the 50s and 60s when it appeared capable of providing educational opportunity and of nurturing scientific achievement, like Sputnik. The Kremlin was a formidable competitor in the 50s and 60s when it could easily discredit the West for its ongoing imperial record in the Third World. Leaders of national liberation movements in the Third World, even though few of them were communists, very few of them, were attracted nonetheless to the Kremlin. They were attracted to the Kremlin because of its pronouncements against imperialism and against racism. They were attracted to the Kremlin because of its fast track to modernization and to achieving great power. Few of these Third World leaders had been to Moscow for any amount of time. Few of them knew the costs of this system of modernization. But with the passage of time, perception changed. Communism started to lose its appeal in Asia and Africa. When the era of decolonization ended, as it did in the mid-1970s with the final breakup of the Portuguese Empire. Planning began to lose its appeal when the Chinese abandoned it, or at least started to abandon it at the same time in the late 1970s and the early 1980s. The Kremlin could not compete, moreover, when it began to be apparent, also at the same time, in the mid and the late 1970s, that Soviet leaders could not make good on their promises to offer their own peoples and those of Eastern Europe superior health care, education, housing, food, and entertainment. So in other words, consumer capitalism, welfare democracy, and socially committed market economies like the one in West Germany won the Cold War. When the peoples of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union had a chance to choose, when actually Gorbachev gave them a chance to choose at the end of the 1980s, they rejected the Soviet model and the Soviet Union. So to what extent is this narrative salient for contemporary problems? I think it's very salient. What's most important in the Cold War, or what's most important in understanding the Cold War, was not superior military capabilities, was not sophisticated public diplomacy, was not the artful foreign policies of the West. As valuable as all these things were, they were not of decisive importance. What proved most important was the capacity of the West, and I mean the West broadly defined, to offer and sustain a way of life that appealed to large numbers of people, a way of life that respected the dignity of individuals, a way of life that nurtured civil society, a way of life that provided security, afforded opportunities, stimulated fantasies, and engendered creativity and entrepreneurship. There are then critical lessons that the Cold War has to offer us And I'd say they are 7 in number. So let me quickly go through them. First, it's important to understand the threat. Understand the threat. Today there are many threats. I enumerated them at the beginning of the lecture. Terrorism, climate warming, an ambitious China, etc. There are many threats today. But there actually were many threats during the Cold War as well, even though nowadays we tend to simplify them. Nonetheless, I think almost all historians would agree that the most successful American policies during the Cold War were actually at the very onset of the Cold War, because the United States grasped in 1946, 47, and 48 that the primary threat to the West and to the United States was not the likelihood of Soviet military aggression. The greatest threats, understood by Truman and his closest advisors in 1946 and 47 and 48, was socio-economic ferment in Western and Soviet Union, and in the long run, the possibility of revanchist nationalism in Germany and Japan. These conditions, U.S. policymakers understood, could provide opportunities on which the Soviet Union might capitalize, could capitalize. Secondly, in addition to defining threats carefully, one needs to define goals carefully. The overriding goal of American national security policy throughout the Cold War was to deny the Soviet Union either direct or indirect control over the preponderant resources and industrial infrastructure and skilled labor of Europe and Asia, to deny the Soviet Union direct or indirect control over those resources. This orientation placed a focus on Western Europe, West Germany, and Japan. This orientation led to the Marshall Plan and to the economic rebuilding of West Germany and Japan. Those countries, in turn, needed markets and raw materials in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa. Hence, preserving stability in those regions became an important national security goal of the United States. Note, the goal was stability. It was not democracy promotion. This sometimes had very unfortunate consequences, but it reflected policymakers' readiness to make tough decisions in behalf of a clear and overriding goal as they defined it, denying the Kremlin indirect or direct control over the critical human, industrial, and raw material resources of Eurasia. The third lesson: the United States benefits from an open world. At the end of World War II, there was a huge debate in the United States about America's role in the international economy. Officials focused at the time on the lessons they, in the 1940s, had learned from the interwar years. In their view, high tariffs, rigid currency policies, and quantitative restrictions on trade had retarded growth. Hence, after World War II, they decided to focus on lowering tariffs, stabilizing currency, and promoting the free flow of goods. These steps ushered in the most prosperous period in human history for the peoples of Western Europe and Japan. The United States exercised a benevolent hegemony, co-opting old enemies and promoting global prosperity, even though such initiatives engendered, as they did, some real costs. Fourth lesson: open markets and free enterprise must be tamed and regulated by an enlightened state. The dynamism of free markets must be harnessed to meet the needs of the people. Franklin Roosevelt understood this very clearly. In 1944, at the same time that he was calling for support of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the United Nations, he also called for an economic bill of rights at home. It was essential, Roosevelt said, to sustain the New Deal at home after the war. This meant preserving an important role for the government in American life. The government, Roosevelt said in two of his most famous speeches at the end of the war, must ensure employment opportunity, decent housing, adequate medical care, and security in old age. Now, the United States, Western Europe, West Germany, and Japan won the Cold War because these governments prevented another depression and because they avoided intra-capitalist conflict. The United States, Western Europe, West Germany, and Japan won the Cold War because their governments, broadly defined, harnessed the marketplace to meet the needs of their peoples. Over time during the Cold War, the old left was co-opted by improved standards of living, better working conditions, growing equality, more educational opportunities, and the provision of unemployment, disability, and old age insurance. The new left and the rebellious youth of the baby boom generation were also co-opted by the lure and glamour of consumer capitalism and by mass entertainment. By regulating business and managing the business cycle, the state provided security, ensured opportunity, and nurtured equality. And it wasn't coincidental that at the very end of the Cold War, when European nations were negotiating the Single European Act, they complemented it with a social charter that provided for maximum working hours, minimum working age, rights of workers to organize, equality for women, and protection of the handicapped. The fifth lesson: multilateralism, not unilateralism, works. The United States actually did, on numerous occasions, act unilaterally during the Cold War and often made things worse, not better. For example, when the United States decided, more or less unilaterally, to cross the 38th parallel and unify all of Korea in August and September of 1950. It acted unilaterally, more or less, when it chose to intervene militarily with combat troops in Vietnam. Now, cooperating with allies during the Cold War was never easy. In fact, it was usually excruciatingly difficult. But multilateralism was a key to victory in the Cold War. Co-opting friends and former adversaries into alliances mattered a great deal. And it's perfectly obvious that all the great issues of our times, collapsing financial markets, terrorists, nuclear proliferation, global warming, all of them require multilateral collaborative action. Sixth lesson: talk to the adversary. Throughout the Cold War, the United States talked to the Soviet Union, and the frequent summit meetings between Gorbachev and Reagan were immensely productive. Likewise, one should never forget that relations with Beijing improved only after talks began. And these talks began soon after the Chinese tested their own nuclear weapons, and when repression, chaos, and brutality were at high tide in China. One always has to remember, when one negotiates with an adversary, as in fact the United States did throughout the Cold War, that one's adversary will believe, just as the United States believes, that it is essential to negotiate from strength. One's adversary believes that cliche as much as did American officials. A seventh lesson: acknowledge the necessity of moral ambiguity. Values should be pursued prudently, thoughtfully, persistently, but interests cannot be ignored. Grand strategy is about difficult choices in an uncertain world with limited capabilities. In such a world, trade-offs are inevitable, and they're wise. So here are the lessons for the contemporary era. We need to identify principal threats and define primary foreign policy goals. We must set priorities and accept difficult trade-offs. We must not overreach. We need to talk to our adversaries and collaborate with our allies. We must stay focused on revitalizing our own societies, realizing the importance of the state in regulating markets and fostering opportunity. Healthy societies are the ones that seek justice, welfare, and equality, as well as freedom. Such societies, in the long run, diffuse foes, win converts, and empower their own citizens. And therein rests not only individual security, but international and national security as well. Thank you.
Floor is open for question and comments. Yes, please wait for the microphone. Just a second.
Thank you very much.
Roy, would you re-identify yourself, please?
Excuse me, Roy McLeod, Smithsonian and Sydney, and relevant to this, the editor of a Cold War journal, so to speak, that continues today under less Cold War worldly influences. A question simply because you didn't mention the role of intellectuals, the role of thinkers, the role of philosophers, artists, writers. Mm-hmm. Do you, without questioning the accuracy or the validity of what you've just said, I wonder, do you not ascribe any importance to their presence, their existence, the relationships, as it were, in science and in research and in literature and in culture, the sorts of things that we had a lot of support from a number of organizations, foundations, CIA, a lot of organizations. Wherein does all this lie in your story?
Well, they're an integral part of this story. Part of my emphasis is that not part of, but critical to my entire interpretation is that the Cold War was a contest between systems. In our system, in the Western systems, the possibility of technological innovation and scientific achievement and the dissemination of technology were far more likely to occur than in a Soviet command economy. And it's because of our ability to innovate and embrace research and technological innovation that America's competitiveness and that Western competitiveness, broadly defined with the Soviet Union, was decided decisively in favor of the United States. So in terms of technology and research, this is an integral part of the story of why the West won the Cold War. Also, obviously, intellectuals and philosophers and others play a key role in this, in the sense that the Cold War was a struggle about defining alternative ways of life. It was a struggle about how to think about human welfare in a modern world. And in that contest obviously intellectuals played a critical role in defining options and shaping contemporary public thought.
Thank you. Frédéric Bozot?
Yes, first of all, thank you, Mel, for an elegant and profound talk, as usual. I'd like to push you in an angle that you sort of opened at the beginning but didn't really dwell upon for the rest of your talk. And that is linked with what you said in the early phase of your talk on the importance of the link between the socio-economic context and the Cold War. And I'd like to hear your views on the relationship between globalization on the end of the Cold War. Now, I don't have a definition for globalization, but I take it as basically expressing what you've described as the transversal chapters in the history of the Cold War that you directed with Oda and Westad, that is contemporary issues, terrorism, environment, all that really appeared and became important issues after the Cold War, which are transversal issues. Mm-hmm. And I have three questions. One, what in your view is the relationship between globalization, if indeed this is something that emerges in the late 20th century, and the end of the Cold War? Gorbachev certainly believed there was a major link when he said, we have to face new challenges, the environment, culture, that cannot be dealt with in a confrontational manner, which cannot be dealt with bloc to bloc. So in his mind, there was a link between globalization and the end of the Cold War. What do you think? Two, looking at the post-Cold War era, let's say the first 2 decades after the Cold War, one of the themes when looking at when analyzing U.S. policy was that basically the U.S. was winning not only the Cold War but globalization. The U.S. was thriving on globalization more than any other powers, including Western Europe, including Japan. And this probably culminated somewhere at the end of the 90s or the early decade of this century, probably started under Clinton. I remember the G7 summit in Denver when there was a sort of triumphalism, not only in winning the Cold War, but in winning the globalization. If this is the case, and if indeed the U.S. did profit from globalization for those 2 decades, why did that lead to wrong policy decisions? Globalization, one would think, should lead to more multilateralism, as you said. Indeed, it led to U.S. unilateralism, probably culminating in the war over Iraq in 2003. So my second question is, why did the U.S. in a way didn't figure globalization the way it could have figured it? And finally, now that globalization is a tide that is turning, in a sense, against the U.S. and against the West in general, and is really profiting to emerging powers or competitors of the West and the U.S., how do you see the U.S. policy debate in that new phase?
Okay, we have another lecture here on the United States and globalization in the late Cold War. Now, I'll try to answer your questions, Frederick, succinctly. What do I think about globalization and the end of the Cold War? I think globalization was very important in shaping the conditions that determined policy toward the end of the Cold War. You yourself answered that question when you said that Gorbachev believed it. The very fact that Gorbachev believed that globalization was important and that the opening of markets and the dissemination of new technology and the growth of numerous economies, and not just the American economy, but the economies of China and even more particularly of the so-called Asian tigers in the mid and late 1980s, that Gorbachev saw or believed that openness and open markets and the free flow of capital were critical to achieving a viable economy that could provide for the well-being of its own people. And so he reconfigured policies accordingly in ways that never worked, but that was his ideal. And in fact, we know from the public record that when Schultz, for example, met with Gorbachev, he explicitly talked about these things, and Gorbachev was very interested in discussing them. So in shaping Soviet policies, globalization was very important, and Soviet policies, Gorbachev's policies, were critical to the end of the Cold War. So globalization was very important in terms of understanding the end of the Cold War. The second part, the U.S. policy seemed to be thriving on globalization, so how come we wound up with some inappropriate, as you suggested, policy decisions? Well, the American economy was partly thriving on globalization, or so it seemed in the 1990s, but there were also a lot of structural problems in the American economy in the 1990s, and with regard, for example, the distribution of income, growing inequality, things of that sort that were beginning to appear and would increase over the next decade. And what happened is there's somewhat of an irony here, because in the mid and late 1970s, one could say that both the West and the East were afflicted economically. Both the West and the East faced profound economic problems in the mid and late 1970s. I mean, it was Time magazine in 1975 that had a front page article that said, quote, "Can capitalism survive?" End quote. That was Time magazine in 1975 in the context of the growing stagflation and other economic problems, increased oil prices, currency instabilities, etc., that the United States and the West was facing in the mid-1970s. The Soviets also were facing growing economic problems in the mid-70s that their policymakers were aware of. The United States and the West responded in a variety of ways in the in the late 1970s and early 1980s, including the move toward European integration, which was critical in this entire story, but also toward a reiteration of the importance of open markets and the free flow of goods and the actual contraction of state regulation. And initially, I would say in the 1980s and early 1990s, this contraction, this rollback of the state actually did have a positive impact on the economy, but that incrementally, as the deregulation process gathered an increasing momentum, it had very portentous consequences, which really unfolded in the financial crisis of 2007 and 8. So what I am suggesting in this lecture is that what's really important is to get the balance right between free markets and government regulation, and that for a while the United States and the West seemed to be getting it right, but probably went much too far.
All right, we have 15 minutes left and 5 people on my list. So I'm going to close the speakers list and ask everybody no more 3-part questions. So we'll go first with Sam Wells.
Well, let me give half a question because it piggybacks on Frederick's 3-parter. One of the elements of this globalization that you could use, Mel, to flesh out the inadequacies of triumphalism is the pell-mell movement toward deregulation and privatization. And this, of course, does not start with Reagan, and he was not totally a free market person, but it begins really heavily under Carter, and the economists are pushing this from that time on, and we see it going through Reagan and into the 90s and coming full-blown into the Bush administration. But it's this notion that the markets will regulate themselves that is at the core, I think, of a lot of the problems.
Yeah, I would just agree with that, but with the important caveat, once again, of trying to get the balance right between markets and states. And one of the most important developments of the period from the mid-'70s, let's say, to the mid-'90s, was the decision of many governments in the Third World, in Asia and Africa, to abandon or to hugely modulate their commitment to state planning. The Chinese, you might say, in some ways led the way, but just as important was the fact that the government of India in the late 70s and early 1980s began to abandon its embrace of state planning and nationalization of key industries. So the large parts of the world embraced the idea of liberalization, or the Washington Consensus, as it was called in the 1980s. Not because of America's hegemonic power, which actually in the 1980s seemed to be eroding, not gathering in strength, but eroding. At the time of the Cold War came to an end, actually, it was common to say that both the United States and the Soviet Union lost the Cold War and that Germany and Japan had won the Cold War. That was, after all, the message in some ways of Paul Kennedy's famous book and quite a few others at the time. So, I think the move toward freer markets was an essential part of the revitalization of the West, accompanied, of course, with sophisticated efforts to integrate at the same time, and that this actually was a catalyst to Western economic growth and development in the 1990s. But when carried to what some people would say to an extreme, or when it went too far, ultimately had very disastrous consequences.
Thank you. Ross Johnson. And Ross, if you could pass the microphone to the gentleman behind you, we'll take two questions at one time. All right, go ahead, Mr.
Indeed, the Cold War was, as you've so well described, a competition of two social economic systems, and yet, wasn't there an asymmetry in the extent of true belief and true believers on both sides? And once we get to the end of the '60s, to the extent you ever could find true believers in Eastern Europe, they're pretty much gone, and increasingly it's difficult to find them in the Soviet Union. So while this model has attraction still in many parts of the world, at home it's losing its core. And so would you agree that there's an asymmetry? And if so, we still have 20 years of this going on and on and on, inertia, or how do we think about that?
Yeah, and hold on, let's take another question. Go ahead.
Mel, I'd like to press you on something that you've said and get your response after you answer Ross's question. It's linked to your notion that there was not moral clarity on the part of Reagan's people. And it strikes me that I think you have to, maybe you should reanalyze, modify a bit. I think you're confusing moral clarity with the language of democracy. I think that if you look closely both at what he said and what he did and the people around him, that the goal, from their point of view, the goal of a good society was to release and reward individual endeavor. That, in turn, was the key to prosperity that would lift all boats. Economic freedom of that sort would lead to a society inevitably of political freedom, but that political freedom meant the freedom of autonomous action and not particularly democracy or equality. Thus, a Chile, for example, could be free despite an incredible dictatorship. That's linked, it seems to me, to the one area of your lessons that has internal meaning, implications for the U.S., and that's the notion that it was a lesson that open markets and free enterprise must be regulated and harnessed to meet the people's needs with an importance of equality. And I think I want to press you on that. How do you defend that against an argument that would say, no, that the purpose of state action is to promote an environment, a free market environment that will create prosperity rather than equality, and that it was the attractiveness of the results of that prosperity that undermined the attractiveness of the alternative regimes?
Thank you. Mel?
Okay. These are very excellent questions. And I don't know, Ross, your question about the asymmetry of belief or conviction, East and West, what I would suggest to you is that you read the contemporary literature in the mid-1970s about convictions in the West, and you'll see that lack of confidence, uncertainty, ambiguity about the West's own systems, broadly defined, was pretty prevalent. In fact, skepticism, cynicism, criticism was widespread in the West in the 1970s. Zbig Brzezinski repeatedly wrote President Carter that the growth of Eurocommunism in Western Europe was as ominous as it had been in 1946, 47, and 48. I think and the other part of that question is I think that one's retrospective view of what was going on in the Soviet Union in the mid-1970s is often overstated. That is, the Soviet economy was not collapsing in the mid-1970s. The Soviet economy only collapsed when Gorbachev started to make huge practices. The Soviet huge changes in the late 1980s, especially 89 and 1990. In the mid-1970s, the Soviet economy was not growing rapidly anymore. Soviet leaders understood that it was beginning to stagnate, but stagnation meant very limited growth. Not decline, but very limited growth. And in fact, as quite a few writers about the Soviet Union in the Brezhnev years are now beginning to write. In fact, we had one of them here this morning at the Woodrow Wilson Center. The Brezhnev era in the Soviet Union was not one of enormous dissent, although in the West, the few dissenters got a lot of publicity. But for the most part, Soviet citizens were reasonably content in the 1970s, and hoping, of course, that the system would get better, which it did not. And it was that disillusionment that increasingly set in year by year and gathered momentum. So I would say that there were ideologues and cynics both East and West, and that one of the real challenges for historians is to look at the late 1970s and 1980s and investigate in greater depth why the West, broadly defined, was able to revitalize and come to terms with the West's economic challenges so much more effectively and decisively than the East. As far as Les Benedict's comments about moral clarity, I'm not quite sure I understood the full thrust of his question, but of course the issue of moral clarity is an important one, and I'm not quite sure what he was saying about the language of democracy but it was quite clear to everyone in the world at the time that Ronald Reagan and members of his administration were championing the so-called freedom fighters, even while some of those freedom fighters were incredibly repressive and extraordinarily uncommitted to the very principles that the United States allegedly was committed to. So there was a great deal of hypocrisy, in my view, in the actions and the rhetoric. If you compare the rhetoric to Reagan's actions, I think there was incredible disjuncture between the two in terms of his policies in parts of the Third World, and especially in Central America. Your comment about the role of deregulation and free markets in terms of nurturing prosperity, I totally agree with that the idea was to promote prosperity and opportunity for all. There's no question about that, and it's a key theme of the lecture I gave, that the system was designed to accomplish that. However, the initiatives that had gone on from roughly the end of World War II until the mid and late 1980s was that those initiatives also bred a degree of greater economic equality in the United States, which most people understood was happening and appreciated was happening, and that the dimension of equality, relative equality, not perfect equality, but certainly equality of opportunity, which inheres in certain types of state actions, is critical to bringing about a better society, at least in my view.
Thank you. A couple minutes left. Roger and I'd like to bring this seminar to a close just about 5:30. So, but I do want to give Sonia Michel, who's been patiently waiting, and also our Italian colleague, a chance to ask two, hopefully brief questions, with all the pressure on Mel to answer even more succinctly.
Okay, this will be
Sonia.
quick. As I understand it, the thrust of your argument is that one of the reason the Cold War, that we won the Cold War, was because we shared goals with the Soviet Union, and we just outcompeted them. I mean, we had shared goals. If you think about the kitchen debates, there obviously symbolizes this competition. Would you say that we now share goals with the two primary poles of the world competition, that is China and the countries that support Islamic fundamentalism? I mean, in other words, can we use that same model of competition in this case?
Well, what was that's a great question, Sonia. What was critical to the competition actually with the Soviet Union was not so much the way the United States defined the goals, but really what was critical was the way the Soviets defined the goals, that they actually defined them most explicitly in terms of standard of living, and of course throughout most of the Third World, broadly defined raising standards of living, eradicating poverty, providing educational opportunity. Those were the dimensions by which most peoples around the world and most governments define the contest. I would say that the United States certainly defined the contest partly in terms of preserving, at least at home, issues of equality and political freedom, but that actually in the pursuit of stability and competition, those with the Soviet Union, those factors were not quite so critical in its actions abroad. In terms of the way the United States acts today, that vis-a-vis China, I think that's a critical factor. Certainly, the Chinese are defining the success of their system in terms of the standard of living they can provide for their people. We define it in a more, I think, complex, nuanced, and desirable way. Yes, you need to provide improving standards of living for your people, but it needs to be accompanied with political freedom, etc. If the Chinese if the Chinese should succeed at sustaining economic growth, I suspect that the dynamic within Chinese society will also bring about more political freedom over time. In terms of the competition with Islamic fundamentalists, no, I don't think that that's a key criterion. In fact, I think that radical Islamic fundamentalists are actually rejecting explicitly rejecting many of these values. So I don't think that criterion is salient, but I also don't think that the rhetoric of Islamic fundamentalism resonates that well within most Islamic societies. So that's how I would comment on your question. Really good one.
Final question.
Well, this is important challenge to have this last word. I would like firstly thanks to Professor Leffler for this appealing conference. My question would be about the cultural effort of the United States during the Cold War. I strongly agree with you that America won the war, but I'm not sure that if America won the hearts and mind of the European. I'm from Spain, and maybe this is one of the highest, in Spain we have one of the highest level of anti-Americanism. And my question is, as in the 50s or 60s, there was a book titled The Cultural Diplomacy as the Neglected Aspect of International Relations. Do you think that because the end of USIA are in comparison vis-a-vis with the growing effort of Chinese power, that if this neglecting aspect of international relation is happening again with the United States?
Excuse me, could you just identify yourself once more, since I misidentified you?
It's no problem. Well, I'm Francisco Rodriguez, a full writer in George Washington University from Spain.
Mel.
I think that during the years of the Cold War, there were obviously periodic bouts of significant anti-Americanism in Western Europe. It was true during the Vietnam years. It was true as well during the debates in Europe about deploying the Persian II missiles in the early 1980s. So yes, there was a lot of anti-Americanism, but broadly in Western Europe and parts of Southern Europe at various times. But there was much of this anti-Americanism was often specifically focused on the policies of the government at the time. And actually, when polling data is segregated and you look at what people's thought about what the United States stood for or its values, the sympathy of or the stature of the United States, even in Western European opinion, was much higher in terms of what it stood for. But most particularly, to address your question, I would say in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union, where the United States was really waging the Cold War, there was a pervasive sense that what the United States stood for was increasingly superior in the late 70s and the early 1980s. And so it doesn't mean that all American policies were supported, but I think what the United States stood for was widely appreciated. In fact, when you look at polling data from 2000 to 2008, the American Political Science Association about a year or so ago did a very extensive assessment of America's standing in the world during recent times. And once again, the polling data often illuminated that although George W. Bush and his policies engendered enormous criticism in certain parts of the world. Nonetheless, the image of the United States, although very tarnished, was still substantially better than was the policy of the Bush administration, and so distinctions were made between what the United States stood for and what the United States was doing. But in this study by the American Political Science Association, I was also, if you read it all, one of my colleagues did it in the political science department at UVA. That's why I know about it. And what attracted me or surprised me was a full assessment of America's standing in the world from 2001 to 2008, which showed that there were quite a number of places in the world where America's image was not so bad. America's image was not so bad in China. It was not so bad in Japan. It was not so bad in India. It was not so bad in large parts of Africa. And so when you think about the entire world, it's a much more complex picture in any case. So,
thank you, Mel. This was brilliant, as always. We all owe you a round of applause for a thought-provoking discussion and thoughtful responses to all of your good questions. Please join us for a glass of wine outside. Roger, any final words? Okay, thank you so much. See you next week at 4 o'clock.
Great now.